Hey, welcome to the Proxy. My name is Phil Morse, and I am coming to you from CatchMark Studio in downtown Whitehall. I'm here to be your proxy by asking my guests questions that you may have regarding our topic. You can also interact by submitting questions as well on the YouTube station that you're on. And if you're concerned about your name, just want to put a plug in there. If you're concerned about your name being on there and you want it to be more of an anonymous question or comment, then make sure that you just log out and you can still submit it that way. And then this conversation can contribute to your thoughts on the topic of military and the United States military and even worldwide, and because an examined opinion leads to discernment. On this episode, I have coming live from Washington, D.C., or Alexandria, Virginia, Chris Mulder. He's joining us to share his experience and perspective on the military and people that have proposed different reforms and reductions of the military, but also just in general items that we're going to have in the conversation. So thanks, Chris, for being on my podcast.
You're welcome, Phil. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So please know, Chris, and Colonel Mulder, I should say, and to my audience, that I try to think of questions that will help people understand the topic, and in some cases ask questions of people that might not necessarily agree with our guests and the perspective that you have, Chris. It doesn't mean that I endorse or oppose your viewpoints or have these questions myself. To our audience, make sure that you subscribe and click the notification bell. And I can only learn so much about a topic being covered. So again, I hope you interact, because there may be some of you in our audience who can formulate great questions for me to ask Colonel Mulder of the Air Force. And if it's a reasonable question and we have time, I will ask it. My hope is to build bridges and to tear down walls. All right, let's get started. So Colonel Chris Mulder of the Air Force. Tell us a little bit about your professional background to lend credibility to what we talk about today.
Sure, Phil. Before I get into that, one, I wish I was there with you in person. I know it's snowy and cold, and it's 80 degrees here and sunny, but I always prefer, engaging in person. But thank you again for having me on the show. And the other just admin piece here is I am coming to you and your guests in my personal capacity. So any viewpoints or opinions that I have aren't representative of the United States government or the Department of Defense. They're mine alone. And so we'll kick it off now. And I was born into a military family. My dad was a career Air Force pilot and nuclear physicist. And I was actually not only born in a military family, but I was born at a military hospital. And not only a military hospital, but I was born at my alma mater, the United States Air Force Academy, in their hospital when they had a hospital. Fast forward a little bit, I went to the Air Force Academy, where my father went to with the dream of becoming a pilot. My dream came true, and not only just a pilot, but I became a fighter pilot. I've flown fighter pilot, or F-16 specifically, all over the world, to include Germany, South Korea, in South Carolina, and then I did my training in Texas. I've flown combat missions over Iraq and Libya, and then I've served in higher headquarter staff positions as well, to include a command billet in Texas, where I commanded 500 people. And now what I do is I work in security cooperation and security assistance. And so that's a little bit about me, Phil.
All right. Thanks, Colonel. So what is the day in a life of a colonel in the Air Force look like? Now, you, again, I want to point out that you don't actually work in the Pentagon, but you work in the building close by, and you have worked in the Pentagon in the past. So if you could give us a little background about what a day in the life of a colonel in the Air Force looks like.
Sure. It can be very dynamic, and it can change rapidly. So for me personally, what I do now is I do a lot of communication, both email, phone calls, gathering data, analyzing data, I'm calling people around the world. We're going to meetings. We're setting up meetings. We're developing proposals and strategic plans. We're looking at budgetary matters. Um, so generally, that's kind of what a colonel does in the Pentagon. We advise, our civilian leadership, our military leadership, since we're the closest, to the unit level. Um, but it is a little bit different than what a colonel would be doing at a base, a base in Texas or Oklahoma, where they're actually leading hundreds, thousands of people. But I feel like my work currently is very impactful and I'm making a difference.
So now did you have a kind of a choice in which path you took here, being in Alexandria, Virginia, or I mean, how does that work? How does the ladder work with your job?
Yeah, to some degree, yes and no. So when I was in Texas, after I commanded a unit, I was offered to come to Washington, D.C. to work at a think tank. A think tank is an organization that they do studies, they do analysis, and they work, primarily in the Beltway to have influence. And so for a year, I was at the think tank, and then after that, I worked in the Pentagon for a year at the highest level in the office of the Secretary of Defense. And then from there, the individual that I replaced in my current organization went to the National Security Council, and he thought a fighter pilot would be a good, fit for that particular position. So he selected me. He worked through kind of our human resource division to select me, and I started in my current position.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let's get down to some nitty gritty here. First, I mean, probably top of a lot of people's minds. What's your thoughts on the targets that have been flying over our country and being shot down? What's your thoughts on those?
Yeah, so first of all, I used to be a huge fan of balloons. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta is held every year. And I remember going to the fiesta every year and just being awed at, 500 balloons launching at one time. Well, I kind of lost track of balloons, like probably most Americans have, except for 2 weeks ago when balloons, became a fixture of our life. And so I think, I'm a half glass full type of guy. And I think under the current circumstances, it's actually beneficial for our nation to look at our procedures, our radar systems to make sure we can track these balloons and other flying objects in the future. And then, I mentioned I was an F-16 pilot. We never trained to shooting down balloons or other unusual objects. And I guarantee you that those F-22 pilots never trained about shooting down a balloon. So I think we have learned probably a lot, the United States Air Force, about how to identify, how to track, how to engage, balloons. And I think we'll be able to carry that forward. Thankfully, it was in a relatively benign, situation and environment. And so that's why I think, it's actually probably is in our benefit that we went through that experience. Another little fun fact for you is the F-22s that shot down the first balloon over the Atlantic, they used the Frank call sign. And during World War I, balloons were actually strategic intelligence capabilities. And so fighter pilots would have to go well into enemy territory to try to shoot down these balloons that were collecting intelligence on, the enemy's movements and other matters. So Frank Luke Jr., he shot down, I think, 14 balloons in World War I, and in his honor, those F-22 pilots used his name
Wow,
when they flew those missions.
wow.
So
So are you at liberty? Because I know there's certain things that you can't talk about that are confidential or classified. Are you at liberty to say what your opinion is on that initial air balloon that went all the way across the country and what they were up to? Is it as much of a conspiracy as some people think it is? Was it innocent? Just a weather ball, air balloon? Can you share your thoughts on that?
yeah, I mean, I only know what I've seen in the news, and I'm pretty confident our government did think it was definitely a Chinese balloon that was, collecting information. Um, that's really all I know. Um, and I don't think, there's a conspiracy theory there. It's just an unusual event that we identified, and then we had to, come up with the best course of action, and that's how our commander in chief decided to handle it.
Okay. All right. So, what are the categories that our defense budget is broken into today? Like, for example, nuclear forces, missile defense, special operations, etc. How many different categories are there, and what are they?
Yeah, so I would actually elevate the categories, the question a little bit higher, and then we can kind of drill down. So the categories are really operations and maintenance. So putting fuel in a planes, buying spare parts, and then you have military personnel, so paying salaries, healthcare, and then you have procurement, and then you have research and development, and then you have military construction. The first category, operations and maintenance, about 40%. Military personnel is about 24%. Procurement is 20%. And just to clarify, procurement is buying, new equipment. So new F-35s, new ships, things like that. And then research and development is where we can get into hypersonics and advanced, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, space-based capabilities. But so you have those five categories, and then each of the services, the military departments, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, they have their own requirements, and where they get their requirements from are from the military departments that are spread all around the world. And so there's negotiation between the military departments, the combatant commands in the regions around the world, Congress, and the executive office of the president to then produce a budget. And so where I think we have added quite a bit of funding in recent years is into that research and development pot. And the reason is because the last 20 years, we were heavily focused on fighting our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we had to back off on modernization efforts and then research and development efforts. And China specifically has focused on those two efforts, procurement and research and development. But in the last 2 years, if you look at our budget, we've really kind of refocused on those areas, which is important because we want to maintain an edge over our number one, competitor, and that is China.
So, how would you assess? How would you grade each of those categories as to how successful we are? If you were a teacher and you had that authority, how are we doing in procuring and in being wise with our and stewardly with our money and operations and all those categories?
I think in general, we do a very good job of balancing the needs of our nation, making sure that we secure and protect, the nation by focusing on those five different categories. Of course, there's room for improvement in all of them. I'll tell you that our senior leaders are focused on the acquisition side of the house. There's a lot of bureaucracy and roadblocks in procuring something like, the F-35 and other very advanced weapon systems. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to bake in innovation into the acquisition system that we can kind of procure new weapon systems at a much faster rate, which will then be able that we can use against our competitors. And so that's probably one place that we can focus on is the procurement. Another place that I personally would focus on, and this part of it came from a leadership program I did at the Bush Institute. And so President George W. Bush, one of his post-presidency agenda items is focusing on veterans. And so he set up this program to focus on veterans. I was selected for it. And not only did I focus on veterans, but I focused on currently serving service members. And one of the things I discovered during the leadership program is how powerful it is to focus on the current service member and treat them as a high performance service member. So I think that's where we can probably, you know, add some more resources, just like LeBron James and, Michael Jordan back in our day. They had personal dietitians, personal coaches, counselors that they could lean on as required. And so we do a decent job of supporting service members, but I think we can probably do even more in that military personnel category.
Okay. All right. So talking about budget still, the U.S. spends more than any other country on their military budget by far. At least what's reported. Well, even more than China. China, it says that China has like 300 some $billion. I'm getting the numbers. I should have wrote it down, but where it's like less than half of what we spend, and then from there it's not even close. The next one, it's India's the next one, and so anyway, my question to you is there a need for reduction? That's what some people would suggest, and then even we'll get into the reform, but let's just stick with a reduction in budget.
Yeah, so I want to put this in context a little bit, just because when you do hear a number like $800 billion, that is obviously a lot of money, and it's very difficult to wrap our minds around that. And so, one, yes, we do need to be very judicious with the resources, that we expend on any, program, whether it be in the military or not. And I can tell you in all my jobs that from where I sat, we have always tried to use those resources in a stewardship like way. Now, again, going back to 800 billion, where that comes from is typically how we compare military budgets across the world is by looking at gross domestic product. And so the United States, this blew my mind, but our gross domestic product is $23.2 trillion with a T. And so typically countries around the world spend between 1 and 5% of their GDP, which is all the products and services produced, in that country in their fiscal year, calendar year, on military defense. NATO actually has a requirement of 2%. Not all countries meet it, but that's the baseline. And so the US's military expenditures of that GDP is 3.5%. So relatively, I think we're in line, with other countries, and also with the amount of, GDP. $23 trillion is a huge amount, and that means, we have responsibilities around the world to maintain, commerce, trade routes, and a number of things, which feeds into our national interests, feeds into our prosperity. Um, and so I always think, yes, you have to reanalyze the budget every single year. You have to look at, the defining documents that we use, the national security strategy, the national defense strategy. You have to work with our embassies, and you have to work with the combatant commands. You have to work with Congress to come up with a reasonable military budget that serves our interests.
So, do you think China is being forthright with the amount that they spend?
So what I've seen, doing research, yeah, I think it's around 250 billion, 300 billion
Yeah, I was thinking that.
dollars. Yeah, but with any autocratic, country, they're going to try to hide as much as they can, because they don't want to give away um, an advantage to their adversaries,
Right.
like us, the United States. So my hunch is they probably do spend more than what is publicly available. I mean, they're expanding rapidly, all around the world, and so it's probably more than that, but I really don't know the exact number.
Okay. So you said the GDP, what was it, 27 point something trillion, right?
What 23.2 trillion for the United States.
Do you
Yep.
did you happen to look up China's? when you were looking and remember what it
Yeah,
was?
they're around 17
Okay.
trillion.
All right. So
And
according,
then
go ahead.
and then the next one, I mean, there's a huge difference between China and the next one. I think the next one is Japan at like 4 trillion.
Wow. So yeah, we're a pretty wealthy country, that's for sure. So
Yes.
you got into this a little. No, you know what? I'm going to back up. So I've heard people express their frustration about defense contracts, like a $1,200 toilet. Just for one example. First of all,
Right.
can you verify if that's true? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think there have been times where parts that should have been, Home Depot like prices balloon to astronomical prices. Again, based on my research, I think that primarily occurred in the 80s, maybe the early 90s. I haven't seen a whole lot of that, in recent years, and so it has occurred for sure in the past. And as I'm thinking about this question, I think it's critical that not only the Department of Defense, but our country continue to press innovation and competition. Because what happens is, you have a required part, but only one manufacturer makes the part, and then you've got a demand on that part, and then the manufacturer can, increase prices. But if you have a robust innovation ecosystem and you have a lot of competition, now you have multiple manufacturers creating parts, and then the whole demand supply equation kind of equals itself out a little bit.
Yeah.
One example I think that maybe would help articulate this. So 10 years ago, SpaceX was just entering the launch business, and they really fought to get Department of Defense um, contracts. No kidding, sued the Department of Defense to be able to compete. Well, at the time, it cost at least $20,000 per kilogram to launch something into space, if not more. I've seen, numbers of like 100,000. Well, anyways, once SpaceX got into the launch business, not only for the Department of Defense, but for commercial, they've been able to drive that price per kilogram all the way down to like $3,000 or $4,000.
Wow.
And not only have they driven the price per kilogram down that far, but other launch providers have gotten into the business of launching satellites and other goods into space. So I think it's very healthy, for our country and for the Department of Defense.
So a little competition, you're saying, is a good thing.
Absolutely, yes.
All right. So let's go back to another conversation we started. How would you rank our country's adversaries as it stands today?
So there are 5 that are in our national security strategy, national defense strategy. It's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and violent extremist organizations. I'll add a personal one, and that's the unknown threat. But going back to the ones that are publicly known, I think they're all very different, and they all pose a different threat to the United States and to the region that they're located in. So China, they have 1.4 billion people. Right now, there's it's hard to say whether India has more people or China. They both are around that 1.4 billion. So just sheer size, they're going to, have influence. We just talked about how they've radically, expanded their military. They have advanced capabilities. They're advancing in space quite a bit, which, they militarize space, which is forcing us to, do things in space as well. And they're not only, do they have a large military, large economy, but they have motive and intent to try to change the world order that we know of today, which has served the United States very well the last 75 years. Then you have, Russia, who's clearly, conducting a war, with Ukraine. And so they're not necessarily a threat to us, the United States, in of itself. But as soon as that war spills over into a NATO country, then you have to trigger. Then it'll trigger Article 5, and then other countries will have to get involved. It'll force the United States to get involved, and that starts to become somewhat complicated and more complex than what it is today. Iran, they're trying to procure nuclear weapons. They fund proxy terrorist groups in the Middle East and in other locations, and so that they pose a threat. North Korea, they sit right next to South Korea, a huge economy in of itself. Same with Japan. They're very isolationist. Any existential threat to North Korea, they could lash out, and so that's always a concern. And then you have terrorist organizations that what we saw in 9/11 can be very disruptive. We spent billions and billions of dollars of national treasure, people, resources, to push back the terrorist threat. And so that's always a concern as well. And then you have the unknown. The unknown could be another country. It could be, climate related. It could be an economic disaster. So we have to be prepared to respond, to be flexible to the unknown. And so I think that's the local level or state level. And then, of course, the federal level has a role in that as well.
Okay, thanks for your analysis on that. Just so you know, you get a little bit robotic at different times right now. So I'm going to get into a question here. There's more to talk about, but regarding reform that some people suggest is needed.
Yeah.
Some people say that, like I said, it needs to be reformed. One example is a group called Reaching Critical Will, which is a project of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. They believe our military expenditures are too high. They believe in, quote, continued investment in militarism does not make the world safer. Weapons cannot address the main threats to people all over the world that they're facing, such as natural disasters, increased food prices, and a lack of adequate health care, education, and a clean environment. What do you think about that?
It's a complex discussion. I probably won't do it adequate justice in a few minutes. I am partial to people, and so I do think, there's a balance between spending all your money on, military related activity and then spending money on, people related activity. However, we know history and there's been thousands of wars, conflicts, over the years. I actually was just at the United States Army Museum in preparation for this call. I brought my family there. It's a brand new, beautiful museum at Fort Belvoir Post, just south of Alexandria. And I learned, so I probably knew this before, but there have been 190 campaigns since 1776. And so just inside of our own country, we're fighting a new campaign every couple of years, not in our country, but participating, in various campaigns. And so I think it's to be a responsible nation, we have to have a reasonably sized military that protects our own people and shows the world that we're a leader and we're willing to lead on the world stage. Because if we're not willing to do that, then we probably shouldn't have such a robust, gross domestic product. But I think we should be the leaders, and so that drives a fairly, sizable military. Today, the conventional arms transfer policy was just published by the current White House. And so that's just an opportunity to say, yes, we can have a powerful military. We can sell, goods to other countries, but we have to do it in a responsible way.
So you said we have to have a reasonable sized military. There's some people out there that would say we are way oversized. What would you say to that?
And that goes back to my just putting things into context. when you have such a large economy, you have to have a right-sized military, and typically it's just based off of the GDP and the percentage. It's like take a business. Each business will allocate 2, 3, 4% of their revenue on advertising and marketing because that's a best practice. And so it's no different from other activity like the military as it relates to our responsibilities to our nation.
Okay. If we were to go into war with another country today, what would warfare look like versus warfare from 100 years ago? And I mean, I'm guessing probably against China, it's going to look one way. Against Iran, it will look another. But maybe just try to speak generally, and maybe get a little specific if you want to in the differences that we'd see.
Sure, you're right. I think it would depend on the conflict and the war. Like I said, I was just at the United States Army Museum, and we walked through the World War I display where they have rudimentary rifles, basic armored vehicles. We saw some biplanes, from the Army Air Corps. Fast forward 100 years, now we've got unmanned aerial vehicles. Uh, we have supersonic, fighter aircraft. We've got precision weapons, which are actually beneficial because now you can target, precisely your targets, and you're trying to minimize the collateral damage. Um, but in the Ukraine-Russia war, it's almost like we're in a middle ground between advanced or future warfare and legacy warfare. And they're in almost like a trench warfare, like what we saw back in World War I. They're lobbing artillery rounds back and forth at each other. There's very minimal um, uh, air being used, except for drones that are, the Russians are using, that are being actually built by Iran. But I think in 50 years, we'll see much less close combat warfare. We'll see more warfare take place. There's a term for it. It's called the gray zone. So the gray zone is, information shaping operations. It's using, military equipment to fly near borders to influence, the country. It's using other national sources of power like the economy. Diplomatically, you're using different tools. And then cyber is being used currently, but I think cyber will become even more amplified. And then same with space. I think we'll see more activity in space down the road. So like you said, it'll depends. It'll have different shades depending on the conflict. But what I think will stay the same is if countries want to take land and maintain land, and I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but people will be required to do that. I think we will see robotics. You could send a robot in, to a city to maintain ground to some degree. Um, and then the bottom line, human beings will always be in the loop, regardless of the conflict. So you'll have human beings coding the robots, coding the drones, making decisions back in their home country on what targets to attack. So it's going to be interesting for sure.
All right. Uh, so just a reminder to our audience, you can type in the chat if you have a question for Colonel Mulder. Feel free to participate and engage in that way. Would love to share the question with him that you may have. Okay, so some of your works are on the U.S. Space Force have been published. Can you give us a brief overview of the program, and what would you say to the doubters of the need for a U.S. Space Force program?
Sure, I'm a huge advocate of the Space Force, and the reason is because one, it'll serve our nation well in the future, and then what it also does, it as they are building their program, it allows the Air Force to focus on the Air Force, the legacy Air Force program. But navies, the Army, for thousands of years have been using, specifically the armies, but have been using celestial navigation, right? They've been using space to their advantage. But in more modern times, in the first, rocket that was used to launch a satellite occurred back in 1957 by the Soviets. But ever since then, space has been used for early warning radar purposes, intelligence purposes, communication purposes. But now, like I mentioned, with the reduced launch costs, what's happening is other nations are able to access space commercially. Companies are accessing space, and it's actually becoming congested. As humans, we rely on space activity every single day for communication purposes. GPS is huge. Both of our phones have a GPS. Um, and so what happened back in 2019 is President Trump said, hey, we're going to have a Space Force. And Congress authorized the Space Force in December of 19. And what that has done is all the space activity was already being done by the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army. But after the Space Force was created, a lot of that activity moved into the Space Force. So now you have an organization completely focused on space activity. They're building their own culture, they're developing their own budgets, they're developing relationships around the world with our allies and our partners. And so as space becomes more contested, now we have a dedicated organization that will be able to focus on that. It'll protect, commercial satellites, commercial capabilities. And we're just on the cusp of literally radical changes in space. I can't even imagine what's going to happen in 50, 100, and 200 years. And we're really at the very beginning of developing processes, organizations, and rules that will govern that domain.
So was that another branch of the armed forces?
Yeah, so I'll quickly explain the structure. So the Secretary of the Air Force is in charge of both the United States Air Force and the United States Space Force. So you have one civilian leader that covers down on the Air Force and the Space Force. It's similar to the Navy, where the Marine Corps is subordinate to the Navy. The Space Force isn't necessarily subordinate to the Air Force. They're subordinate to the civilian leadership. And so you have a four-star general that leads the Space Force, and then you have a four-star general that leads the Air Force. And so that's kind of the structure.
Okay. So you're a colonel in the Air Force, as we talked about earlier. What's the next step for a colonel, rank-wise?
So rank-wise, and probably doesn't apply to me, but rank-wise, it would be an 07 or a brigadier general would be the next step.
Okay, and we talked about this a little bit before we went
Right.
live, but what's your aspirations to be a brigadier general?
So I've always said I will serve as long as our military wants me to serve, and when it's clear that my time is up, then I'll be gladly hand the reins over to the younger crowd. So I don't know if the next step is in my future. I would be happy to serve in that capacity, but I'm also happy to serve in other capacities as well.
Okay. All right. If we were interviewing, let's say we were interviewing next week. This is our last podcast for this season, by the way. But let's say we extended another week and we were interviewing somebody, Chris, that was pro reform for military reform, pro reduction of the military budget. What would be a question you would want me to ask them to think about their position?
Yeah, first I would make a statement, and that is, China has radically grown their military, their capabilities, their influence. They have motive, like I talked previously about. And then the question would be, are you aware of this? And now that you are aware of it, Are you concerned? And if you are concerned, what do you think we should do about it?
Okay. All right. Well, Chris, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you're thinking, hey, that would be a really good thing to talk about that you want to bring up?
Sure. One thing, that I do enjoy, I'm not an official recruiter by any means. But I would, if you're out there and you're thinking about, the military as a potential career path, I highly recommend you at least, look into it. It served me very, very well. I can't complain one bit about any of my assignments. I already, gave a quick rundown of all the countries I've served in. I've traveled to another 30 countries. I got to fly high performance airplanes. I've had the opportunity to lead people. And so you really grow as an individual, whether you serve for 4 years, 20 years, or almost 26 years in my case, if you include my Air Force Academy time. But if you're interested in, the military, for sure, look into it, pursue it. If you're a local leader, you know, encourage people to at least consider, the military, whether that be in the Guard, the Reserve, or the active duty. Because, as we're talking about military budgets and, the strength of our nation, it really comes down to the people, and people have to serve not only in the military but also in other capacities. Military is just one way to do it, and so I'm a huge advocate of serving in general. And in my case, it's been the military. So check it out.
All right, that's a good little plug. Hey, I do have one more question for you. Favorite,
Sure.
all-time favorite military-related movie?
Top Gun.
Okay, that's
And
actually
both of them.
one that comes up. That the second one's good too, isn't it? What
Yeah, top.
about American Sniper?
Yeah, that was great. That was a great movie as well.
That's my
Yeah.
favorite. I think it's one of my favorites all-time movie. That is good.
And my favorite, let me tell you this one real quick. My favorite book, it's called Masters of the Air, and it tells the story of the 8th Air Force flying missions during World War II. But it's an easy read. It's packed with great stories. And actually, Tom Hanks is making a series about that book, and I think it's going to come out on Apple TV either this year or maybe next year.
Okay. Did he ask you to star in that movie, in that show at all?
Not yet.
All right. Well, thanks again, Colonel Mulder, for being a part of the Proxy and allowing me to ask you questions that other people may have. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Phil. Doing awesome work. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So this is, like I said, our last episode of this season. We're going to reevaluate things and tweak things and make it a little better. And we'll do season 2 sometime coming up here. We don't have a timeline yet, but I'm looking forward to that. I do want to thank CatchMark for their incredible assistance in doing this. They've put a lot of resources into this opportunity, so I want to tell them I appreciate them. That's Brent, and that's Courtney over here. You haven't seen Courtney yet because she's always behind the scenes, but thank you, Courtney. And she's turning red right now as I'm acknowledging her. So I appreciate their support. That's very meaningful. So I hope you join us next time the Proxy comes up, season 2. Make sure that you subscribe and you click the notification button so that you'll know next time we are going to turn on live again. And then you can submit your reasonable questions, and I can act as your proxy. I'll see you next time, and I hope that you take time to build bridges and tear down walls.